Did you know there was 4 different remakes of Nosferatu? Because I sure as hell didn't. That's right. For day 4, I'm watching one of the several remakes of the 1922 F.W. Murnau Nosferatu, which, if you didn't know, was an unlicensed remake of the book Dracula, which they had no rights to, so that's why it was out of print for a long time, because a lot of those copies had to be burned. Anyway, because I wanted to watch the Robert Eggers one that came out last Christmas, I ended up finding out that there are 3 other different remakes. One that was made in '77, which is kind of like a Spanish language mystery science theater version of Nosferatu. I couldn't find that, so I watched the next one, which was the 1979 Nosferatu, directed by Werner Herzog. And I gotta say, he is a much better documentarian, because this movie, duh rags. It's less than 2 hours, but I swear it felt like it was 3. They cut a bunch out from the Dracula novel, which makes sense because they're aiming more for the Nosferatu, but they cut out a few storylines, which is fine, but that doesn't actually help it move any faster. It actually means that we stay in scenes far longer than we need to, and there's lots of just dead space where nothing happens. And I understand that a little bit in the Dracula part of it, where he is this eternal thing and he doesn't change. That makes total sense. But when we're with literally anybody else, we don't need that. We shouldn't have that. And it makes far less sense. Now, some of this I can kind of forgive because we get into weird territory where they're both trying to do the Dracula novel and the Murnau Nosferatu at the same time, and they don't work together. So it becomes very confusing when we've got characters like Lucy, who's one of the main characters, and Mina, and they essentially swap their roles for no real reason, and it makes it really difficult if you are familiar with Dracula at all. Like, even a passing, you know who some of the characters are. There's Jonathan Harker, there's Dracula, there's Van Helsing, and there's Mina, who the story kind of revolves around. But then we've got, in this one, she's Lucy, but there's also Mina, who's not Mina, is Lucy, but she's also not Lucy either, because she's just this random character who's only in like 2 or 3 scenes. And because we don't have any of the storyline involving her 3 suitors, she's not a character. There's almost no reason for this character to be named and in this movie. It's really frustrating. Because then also, like, we have Van Helsing, who is also Dr. Seward, and it makes less sense because he is not the vampire slayer. He's like, at every turn, he's like, no, there's a scientific explanation for this. And it's just like, who is this character? Why is he named this? Like, we can have this character, that makes sense, but it shouldn't be Van Helsing. Like, we know what Van Helsing's vibe is, we know what he does and who he is. So why is he like this? Even though this movie was really frustrating to me, and honestly, it didn't start off great because we've got this weird credit sequence with the Guanajuato mummies, and it has this weird droning music over it, and it triggered like a migraine for me, so that was awesome. Really put me in a great mood for the rest of this movie. But there's still, like, there are good things here in the movie. It's just there's so much other crap that you have to sift through that makes those things less when you actually get to them. Like there's this weird, like campy, macabre scene in Dracula's castle when they're going over the initial contracts, and there's this weird cuckoo clock on the wall that has a skull on top, and when it strikes on the hour, the skull opens up and this little like skeleton drummer pops out, and then the Grim Reaper comes out the bottom and like circles around and goes back in the clock. And I'm like, wait, why do we have this for just one shot? Like, why can't the movie actually be around this? Because this is bizarre and it makes no sense. It shouldn't be in this movie, but I want to know more about it. Then, like, Kinski, who plays Nosferatu, like, he does a decent job, but you can tell he's having a real hard time with the prosthetic teeth. And it makes his dialogue a little bit more difficult to get through because he's got those teeth all the time, like Max Schreck in the 1922 Nosferatu. It's I couldn't figure out what he was going for because I understand like some of his actual physical mannerisms make sense because he's going for more of a rat vibe. And so like he crosses his hands one over the other like rats do when they're standing. And he's got that like basic vibe down, so that part makes sense. But then there's other stuff where he becomes weirdly aggressive, which actually seems more like just Kinski being Kinski as opposed to the character being the character. And it makes it a little bit more of a weird watch. But honestly, like the MVP in this movie is Isabella Gianni. Like anytime she's in a scene, she immediately catches your attention. And part of it is she just has these huge, almost anime eyes. It gives her this weird ethereal quality. So you can't not look at her when she's in the scene, even when she's really doing nothing. Like at one point, like Van Helsing says, like, oh, she just has a minor fever. But she's obviously like, she's not speaking in tongues. She's not like sweating profusely. It's just like apparently everything was a fever, according to in like this period of time, according to Herzog, because they use that excuse a lot in this movie. Oh, and in case you were wondering, this like the 22 Nosferatu, the city that takes place in is Wismar, Germany, not London, England, like in the Stoker novel. But they had to shoot in the Netherlands, which is very noticeable. If you've only seen like tertiary footage of like Amsterdam and notice that there's a crap ton of canals everywhere through the cities, it looks exactly like that whenever they're in Wismar. And honestly, the first like 20 minutes before we get to Dracula, it looks like the Netherlands just in the 70s, except for all of the characters are dressed in like 18th century garb. And it's not until we're like almost 20 minutes in that we get into the period piece of it. And it's really weird. And I know this wasn't Herzog's like first movie. So it's really, really weird that like he made these directorial decisions and they don't really make sense. Like I know he was like a big fan of the original Murnau Nosferatu, and that's very obvious. Like when you see those scenes that are almost shot for shot from that movie. But then there's other like bizarre things. Like I said, the clock makes no sense. Want to know more about it? We only see it in that one scene for like 5 seconds. But then we have other characters who just come in for one scene and disappear. There's characters who come in at the very end of the movie out of nowhere, and they seem like they're supposed to be important, but because we have no idea who they are or what they're supposed to be doing other than giving exposition, it doesn't go anywhere. And I know like Herzog like made like I read some quotes from his where he's talking about how this town is kind of the problem, that it's just this static bourgeois place where nothing really changes until like the third act, once Dracula gets there, and he is the thing that makes things, that shakes things up essentially. And he's made the argument that Dracula is sort of a sexual character in this movie. And I mean, I don't personally see it. Like, definitely see it's like wearing it directly on its sleeve that vampire as plague is right in there. And that makes sense. You could also make the argument that vampire is plague of a new idea and brings changes. That I can also see, but to a much lesser degree. And it's just like it tries to do a lot, and it doesn't really do what it's aiming for. But like honest, like I said, Isabella Johnny is the MVP in this movie. Like she steals every scene that she's in, even if she's doing nothing. And it's that part of it is awesome. So I might actually see if I can work in Possession with her and Sam Neill later this month. Um, if anybody knows where that's, if that's streaming anywhere, I would appreciate the heads up. Um, but you don't really need to see this unless you're like a Herzog completionist or just a Dracula completionist as well. I mean, like I said, there's some interesting stuff in here. It's just kind of few and far between. And also, like I said, the migraine may have set me in a bad headspace to get in this movie, because by the time we get to the end, it started to remind me of like other more psychedelic 70s stuff that I wasn't in the right headspace for when I saw it. So it could just be where that I wasn't prepared for it properly. But yeah, I think I might need a drink after that movie. But I'll see you tomorrow.